Michigan? How did we lose Michigan? This time on Poll Hub, Hillary Clinton's lament became Donald Trump's victory thanks to narrow wins in states like Michigan and Wisconsin. But brand new polls of those states and Minnesota suggest the tide has turned for Republicans in the upper Midwest. We're going to dig into the numbers. Also, a brand new national poll that we've done, taken entirely after the Trump-Putin Helsinki summit. And a big majority of Americans are worried about what? Plenty, and we'll discuss that as well. So pull up your big boy or big girl pants, and let's get busy. And hi, everybody. This is Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Mergoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll. And that's exactly what we've been doing. Polling.
States, national, you name it.
So with NBC News, we've been in 3 states.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of states that are very interesting this time around because there's Senate races that are competitive, a lot of states where Donald Trump won and it was a bit of a surprise. And so there's really a lot of interest in what's going on in specific states. We've been in 3 of the most important: Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
Yeah, and I think there's particularly, that's easy for me to say, interest in the states, particularly after, again, now I'm saying it correctly, 2016, when I think a lot of people were looking at some of the national polls and not getting a sense or a good narrative of what was going at the state level, and particularly the upper Midwest. So we've taken a look just recently at these 3 states, and we'll probably be back again. But we found some really interesting tidbits going on here. I think most interesting about Michigan, and I'd like to take that state first, is that, as you mentioned, Jay, Trump won. And now not by a lot, just a bit over 10,000 votes. But in 2016, it was actually considered a blue state because of the strong wins the 2 previous times by Obama in 2008 and 12. So I think Michigan was particularly a surprise. But if one of these states has really changed or is very different than what we saw in 2016, I think it is Michigan. We see a couple of things here. First of all, they're going to be having lots of elections in November. They actually have a primary in the beginning of August coming up soon to decide Democrat and Republican nominees for governor.
And there's a lot of people running, right? There's a ton of people, yeah.
Well, because it's also an open seat. They instituted term limits, I think, back in the 90s. So Rick Snyder, the current governor, is term limited. And so, open seats attract a lot of attention from both sides of the aisle. Certainly, Debbie Stabenow, their U.S. Senator, now senior senator since the retirement of Carl Levin, she's actually seeking her 4th term. So they also have, the congressional seats, obviously, and lots of state races and a number of initiatives on the ballot this November. So they're looking to have some big numbers in terms of turnout. And when we look at what people in Michigan and voters in Michigan are thinking, we see that when we ask them who they would like to see control Congress this time around, 45% say they would like to see the Democrats regain control, and 36% want to keep the Republicans in charge. So that's a +9 Democrats.
And that's the so-called generic ballot question.
Well, that is about control. We
asked
the generic question too, which is who people would like to vote for.
In their own
the Democrat, it's the Democrat
thing.
or the Republican. We call it the generic because there aren't any, there's not a specific candidate on it. And actually, Lee, in that case, there's actually a 13-point difference between Democrats and Republicans, with the plus going to the Democrats. So, we see a lot of Democratic interest there when we look at who sees the elections this November as very important. Democrats show their strength there as well. And I know, Lee, that you're going to talk a lot about some of the groups that we want to look at, but especially in Michigan, we're seeing, women, independents, strongly disapproving of Trump. And I think that's the biggest change that we see in the numbers from his election in 2016.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that his approval rating currently is 35% in a state
that he won.
So that's a very, very different political landscape.
And there's another number there that really jumped out at me: 64%. We also you ask a lot of different questions to get at this a lot of different ways. Do you think he deserves re-election, or do you think somebody else deserves a chance? 64% of Michiganders don't think he deserves to be re-elected, and this is what just blew me away. That includes 22% of Republicans.
Yeah, and that's
22% of Republicans in this state say, maybe somebody new.
Yeah, well, I think also Michigan hasn't seen a lot of improvement in the economy. The economy, we know nationally, and we're going to talk a little bit later about this, is really Trump's calling card. They've had a tough time between, water issues that we've known about nationally, Detroit school issues. It's a state that hasn't quite gotten on track. That said, statewide, they often do elect Republicans, and it's really at the national level or the federal races where we see the Democrats have taken hold. So I think that's more of their reputation as a purple rather than a blue state, despite Obama's big margins there.
Yeah, that was I think the stunning thing for people who really on both sides was that Obama won by so much, 16 points in 2008. How does a 16-point win in 2008 and a 9-point win in 2012 become a Trump win, even if it is by 10,000 plus votes in 2016? I think that's what's stunning. But this certainly doesn't this indicate, Lee, that where Michigan went in 2016 is not where it's going, at least in 2018.
It looks like it's going to be a reset, at least talking about federal elections, and I think that's something that we're seeing elsewhere. Now, one of the states that we also looked at was Minnesota. And Minnesota is a state that Hillary Clinton narrowly eked out an advantage, winning it was 1.5 percentage point, 45,000 votes. It did not go the way Michigan and Wisconsin, which we're going to talk about in a second, went for Donald Trump. But certainly it was very close in a state that has not voted for Republicans since Richard Nixon in 1972. Although I recall Ronald Reagan in 1984 running against Minnesota's own Walter Mondale, was about to sweep the entire country minus Minnesota. Right. Yep. And they, if I'm not mistaken, dipped into Minnesota right at the end for one last try.
Try to see if they could make a clean sweep.
To make it the magic. I think that's called piling on a little bit. I think in sports you don't do that when you're ahead. You don't steal a base or punt or do something like that.
You're looking for a legacy,
unless you're the Yankees.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Anyway, so back to the land of the Minnesota Twins. Let's keep this in baseball.
So Obama, carried the state easily, and it was closer last time with Hillary Clinton, a pattern that we've seen elsewhere. And it is a vote that we see in Michigan also. At the state level, odd things can happen. Governorship. So this is the land of Jesse Ventura, which I think most of you still remember. And also Republicans have won the governorship. And Tim Pawlenty, who's running to reclaim his seat this time, had obviously been a former governor and a Republican in that state. Right now, incidentally, he is trailing his Democratic opponent or any one of the several people who are seeking it. Also on the Senate side, Tina Smith, who replaced Al Franken, which
when he resigned,
also noteworthy, is running up a 14-point advantage over the Republican there. So I think what we're seeing, and we could go through lots and lots of more numbers, but again, the generic questions, the control questions, who they prefer to control. Minnesota has a lot of independents. They're always important, and they think they're going to be voting for Congress to send a message about Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, as I'm not sure you mentioned Donald Trump also has a approval rating, is upside down in Minnesota also. He only has a 36% approval rating.
So the numbers in this region, again, why it's so important is because it's a region that the Republicans made either with Donald Trump successful inroads, or they just kind of did a lot better, and they did in Minnesota, but not well enough. And then we see things like suburban white women who are going to be very important in a lot of states, and the disapproval of Donald Trump there is 58%, with only 29% approving of his job performance. So we're seeing the president casting a long shadow in this region, and certainly in Minnesota as well. And it looks like, again, this will be a reset state unless something happens between now and November.
Oh, nothing ever happens.
No September surprise, no October surprise, and no first week of November.
No, political
surprise.
News has been so boring.
And then right across the border is Wisconsin. And Wisconsin, when we look at these three states,
always.
it really fascinated me because Wisconsin, like Minnesota, has this actually really long, deep, progressive, somewhat liberal history. But Wisconsin, in particular, after the Tea Party, movement kind of blossomed, Wisconsin became a laboratory for Tea Party Republicans and big money from big money conservative-leaning groups to pour money in, and they got behind this guy named Scott Walker, and he won the governorship in 2010. You may have heard of him, yeah. And he had run in.
Sorry. I recall his name.
You recall, it's a recall.
Ba-dum-bum.
If you don't know, we're about to talk about a recall. So Scott Walker had run in 2006, but had not gotten any traction, and the Republican in that year lost. He runs in 2010. He runs in 2010 and wins, and immediately does the kinds of things that Donald Trump has done as president right out of the gate, like basically starts blowing things up that you don't think a guy who wins by a fairly narrow margin is going to do. And the biggest thing he takes on, as you'll recall, is the public sector unions.
Absolutely.
The legislature, there's protests, there's the FBI's called it. It's craziness. The Democrats in the state legislature decamp to Illinois so there isn't a quorum, so they can't vote in. I mean, it is madness. I remember that in the midst of that, the cable news shows all moved there, like Hannity and the ones on MSNBC, they all moved there and did their live shots with Madison. Yeah, in the background, because it really was this kind of political war. And then there was the recall. So he gets all this done, then there's a recall vote, and he wins that. So he's even more a hero to conservatives. And then Donald Trump wins this state. Oh, there's something
also
in between,
a presidential candidate,
and he was then
for
an
hour and a half.
Well, yeah, but it's a good point for a brief moment. But at that brief moment, at the beginning of the 2016 season, he was the perceived frontrunner, and it was because of what he had done in Wisconsin. He had taken what was perceived to be a progressive and liberal state, and this new brand of republicanism, this conservative republicanism, had taken hold, and they had found he is kind of one of the prototypes for Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump goes on to win this state by a very narrow margin over Hillary Clinton. If she said it about Michigan, she said it about Wisconsin too. How did we lose Wisconsin? Because Obama had won easily, 14 points.
Yeah.
And then 7 points in 2012, but instead by fewer than 20,000, a little more than 20,000 votes, Donald Trump wins. And so what's happening in Wisconsin now?
I know you also looked at the regions in Wisconsin.
Yeah, we're going to do that.
Found something really interesting there. We talked a little bit.
We're going to do that. Let me real briefly, just like we've talked about in Michigan and Minnesota.
Go through some of the numbers.
His approval rating, he's upside down. Donald Trump, 53 to 35 among Wisconsin adults.
So 35 is the approval.
Yeah, 35 is the approval rating, 53 is the disapproval rating. And in all the ways we've talked about, independence and women and all those kinds of things, Wisconsin very much reflects what we've talked about in these other two states. There's one area in particular that's so interesting to me about Wisconsin. Paul Ryan represents the 1st District, congressional district in Wisconsin, and it is what's called the Milwaukee suburbs. And that's because Milwaukee and Chicago are close enough together that people live in Wisconsin, but they actually work in Chicago, and they commute. And Paul Ryan represents a lot of those folks, and a lot of the other people in that area are kind of the blue-collar, white, somewhat religious, suburbanite kinds of voters that have been his bedrock. I mean, he's been winning re-election since 1998. Paul Ryan's been around. Now, he's retiring. In the Milwaukee suburbs, which is essentially his district, 45% of the voters there disapprove of the job that Donald Trump is doing, and 41% approve. That's a staggering number. It is the only area that is that low in the entire state. Every other area,
That close.
Yeah, every other area is quite a wide margin, which is why the approval rating's upside down. And then if you look at whether there's the strongly disapprove, because we also ask gradations of that. Do you strongly disapprove? Do you strongly approve? And this is where the gap is the biggest, but in a weird way. So no other region has as many people saying they strongly approve of the job he's doing. 27%.
Yeah, it's 22 in Michigan.
Yeah, it's 27% in the Milwaukee suburbs, but 37% strongly disapprove. So it's not 70 or 80%. It's not huge,
Sure.
but there's a very strong approval, but there's a very strong disapprove, and I think that's part of the lesson of Wisconsin is the passion. So the passion was on the side of the Ryan forces. The passion many people thought was actually on the side of the Democrats after the recall and Scott Walker and all of that. But Donald Trump ekes it out. Yeah. But it's very clear here that the passion now is on the side of the Democrats.
Although I found in Wisconsin one counter number to that when we looked at the importance of the midterm elections by these three states. In Michigan, Democrats have a plus 14 over Republicans in terms of the significance of the midterm elections. In Minnesota, that number is 16. In Wisconsin, it's only 2 points.
Yeah.
So people in Wisconsin, Republicans and Democrats, are not as different in terms of how they're approaching the midterms as we're seeing in these other states. Something to watch down the road, I think.
I wonder if part of that is Wisconsin historically has very high voter turnout, and I wonder if there's just more civic engagement there, and maybe that's part of it. One other number before we go away, because we did mention Scott Walker. He's running for re-election. He's up. And so we asked the question, well, do you feel that Scott Walker deserves to be reelected, or it's time to give a new person a chance, which is a different way of asking you to support him or not, or are you going to vote for him? And it's 61% want to give a new person a chance. 34% deserves to be reelected. Not a great number going in to your election.
The campaign handlers will tell you that's sort of a hard question, but as an incumbent, you should be getting at least 40, and then hope you find the rest elsewhere. But below 40% on a real question, that's a
pretty
problem.
tough.
Yeah, the reason why it's tough is because you're not putting a person up against a person.
Right.
It's just, again, this kind of generic, Democrat in this instance, and so you're leaving the door wide open as to what that person would be.
And we talked about the various breakdowns of by party and by gender and all that. So independent, 61% want a new person, but even 16% of Republicans in Wisconsin, 16% say, yeah, maybe we need somebody new. Now, that doesn't mean they wouldn't prefer another Republican, clearly, but dissatisfaction there from somebody who was pretty much the golden boy of this movement that Donald Trump has kind of, inherited. And Wisconsin shows that the bloom is off the rose.
Yeah, and if this turns out to be a blue wave, as some people are anticipating, may not, but some are, clearly Scott will be a big story election night because he's a known figure nationally. And if he loses, then we'll see that. I point out one other thing before we took to the national numbers, and that is when you look at these three states, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin.
I see snow.
The governor's approval rating at 35. I'm sorry, the president's approval rating at 35, 36, and 35. So we did these polls, and I should point out by way of clarification, when we do polls with NBC, we do statewide polls with them. When you hear about the NBC, Wall Street Journal poll,
National
polls,
those are national. We don't do those. Our national partner is NPR and PBS NewsHour with Judy Woodruff.
We like to share the wealth among all of the great media partners.
So sometimes people say, well, what did you get in that NBC national poll? And I say, I don't know. You'll have to ask them. we didn't do that one. Anyway. But interestingly, so we do these three states, and we see Donald Trump's approval rating down from what you might expect and where he's been, and some polls have been showing him mid-40s nationally. And then we did this poll nationally, and drum roll, his approval rating at 39% nationwide in a poll that we did entirely following the Helsinki summit. Clearly, that had a big impact. It may be even one of those defining moments like Charlottesville was on race, or the images of the kids about the immigration and talking about family values and what's in the like. This may be another one of those moments. President Trump on the platform, standing next to Vladimir Putin, and not projecting the kind of strength that is his calling card. But we can look at those numbers too.
And we're going to follow them. We're going to keep following them.
So what did we see in those numbers on Russia? That's the big question, right? So as you mentioned, no, this is really kind of a defining moment, or it seems to be a defining moment, possibly. And so we were in the field to ask the question after, not just like the moments after, but really a few days after. Sure. So this story didn't end the moment that news conference in Helsinki ended. It actually, well, it still goes on now, but the next couple of days had all these twists and turns. So there's an awful lot of information that got out.
And good when you're doing public opinion if you get the opportunity in this nutty news cycle arena that we're in, to let the dust settle a little bit. That does let things sink in, and that may be a better reading of where the impact of this was, and that's what I think we got.
So in addition to the state polls, when taking a look at the state polls, we worked with our partners, NPR and the PBS NewsHour, to take a look at how things, how this all played out nationally. And as you pointed out, Lee, very interestingly, the president's approval rating was just really a notch above what we had seen in these three states. I think one of the things that I saw that thought was really interesting when we asked people specifically about Russia and the summit and what they had been seeing and hearing about all week, we asked whether it was better to build relationships with Russia, or to treat Russia really as a threat to the United States. And there's actually quite a consensus. 59% of Americans thought that it was better for us to be building a strong relationship with Russia rather than having this adversarial relationship with them.
So the president makes a good argument when he says that. He's right in the middle of where the national sentiment is.
Right.
Important point.
But
when it comes to Vladimir Putin, there was a division, which I thought was very interesting, between whether he should be seen as an adversary also, as an enemy, or as an ally. And that one split almost evenly. Then we get to the key question, I think, and that is 64% of Americans, including almost half of Republicans, say that Donald Trump was not tough enough.
Yeah, 47% of Republicans actually agreed with that he wasn't tough enough, which speaks a little bit to your optics issue that he had with the press conference, and that because he is seen, particularly by Republicans, as such a strong leader, but that the whole idea is that he can make the deal, he can really stick up for America against countries around the world. That was a tough image for him.
And one of the other things that came out of the news conference, if you recall, was who do you believe? Do you believe the intelligence services, or do you believe Vladimir Putin? And that was the famous walk back that took place. Wouldn't, he changed the words. But we asked people, well, what do you think? Are you more likely to believe the intelligence community that Russia interfered in the elections, or do you believe that Trump accepts Putin's denial? Do you believe that's the case? And 72% of Americans are more likely to believe the United States intelligence community that Russia did interfere in the 2016 elections, and only 16% believe that what Trump said was that Putin denied it, and it was a strong denial.
And then when you ask it specifically, do you think Russia interfered in 2016? 69% of Americans say yes, including 51% of Republicans. So, we've heard so much, and in terms of the overall image of Donald Trump, his core is intact, his base is intact. We've known that. Everybody's talking about, everybody sees it in their polls. Here's some numbers, however, where Republicans are not exactly uniform in their support of where the president is. That's atypical.
Which is so interesting. Barbara, does that mean that we've talked about cracks in support for 24 months practically? Does this indicate any cracks in support, or is it simply that they agree to disagree?
No, I think they agree to disagree on this particular issue. And what I think plays into these opinions here is that people still do have trust and confidence in the intelligence community. We asked a number of questions about different institutions in this poll as well. Certainly the one that everybody agrees on, a strong consensus, 88% of Americans have confidence in and trust in our military. But after that, it comes down to the Supreme Court and the FBI. And so despite all of the haranguing that they have gotten and the tension between the intelligence community and the administration, I think people still have, really trust in these people to be patriots and to be, to be doing good work.
It's almost 2-1 in terms of the FBI doing its job or biased against the Trump administration. Those numbers nationally are almost 2-1 that they're doing their job. So when the attack is on and the hoax is being talked about, it's really not hitting on the agreeable ears.
But when you talk about Trump's base, I mean, one of the things we did find in this poll is the strength of his base, and in fact, we had seen it wane somewhat in our previous polls, particularly in April. But we see now that has reformed. It's coalesced again in great numbers for him. In fact, when we see a lot of just small changes in some of the numbers. For instance, you talked earlier, Jay, about the intensity of support for the president and how strong that was in Wisconsin. Well, nationally, it's at 25% of people who strongly approve him, and that is the highest that it has been during his term in office. And that's particularly fueled by Republicans and his base. We see his favorable rating also up a couple of points. And again, that's primarily because a greater number of Republicans have a positive view of him at this time. One
of the things that he's been criticized for by Republicans and Democrats is that he just isn't truthful. He just doesn't tell the truth an awful lot of the time. And 61% of the Americans in our poll think that Trump tells the truth at most some of the time. 56% say he's less honest than previous presidents. 60% are embarrassed by his behavior. 62% are more likely to trust their favorite news sources over Trump. Just a series of numbers that
except for Republicans.
Yeah, except for Republicans, kind of get you at this notion that he's not super trustworthy. And that has to, at least in part, be driving some of these approval numbers. Because if you look at other things, like the economy, right? So it is hard to argue, for whatever reason, that the economy is about as good as it's been in many of our lifetimes, right? It's a really long time. Any president running into a midterm with this economy should be looking at bucking the historic trend that you lose some seats in a midterm. Yep. This should be 2002, which for Bush was post 9/11, where you just don't lose any seats, right? I mean, the economy's that good, and to their credit, Americans give him some credit on the economy. So 49% think that there's been a change for the better in the economy, and give some credit to President Trump for that. So there are things that are working for him, but there's so much that seems to be working against him if you look at in the balance at where his approval.
I just want to make one more point on the economy, and not to be overlooked, that very often electoral politics turns on people's perceptions of the economy. So before the Democrats start high-fiving themselves about the blue wave, they better look at those numbers and see that Donald Trump is not seen as negatively on the economy as he is on the world stage.
Although the one thing that I think is just an enormous change that we're seeing during the Trump administration is this gender gap.
We talked about it in the States, and nationally we saw it too.
It's absolutely enormous. There's actually a 43-point gender gap in President Trump's approval rating, which means men approve of Trump 50% to 39%. And women approve of Trump 30% and disapprove 62%. So it's a complete, practically 180.
Yeah, two out of every three women in America disapprove of the president. That's a staggering number. I mean, that's just kind of unheard of.
And it speaks a little bit to what you mentioned, Jay, in Wisconsin, which is this issue of suburban women. Mm-hmm. And that's really where the change has occurred. He actually has a 57% strongly disapprove among suburban women nationally. That's almost inconceivable. That's a really rough number, and those are women that are perhaps soft Democrats, independents, maybe have also voted Republican and have voted Democrat at other times. So it's a group where Republicans have actually done well in the past, and something to really be watched as we go into the midterms.
Now I'm going to contradict what I said just a few moments ago. So if you're a Republican and you think that Donald Trump's numbers on the economy are about to stay off, keep away, contain the Democrats' blue wave,
yeah.
You got to worry about the suburban women. 57% of whom are not exactly in your corner. So,
don't call it the pink wave.
I didn't do that. I did not do that.
Who would have even thought of that, Jay?
Yeah, that was me. Well, I'm looking for something to go through. The red wall, the blue wave. It's all about.
So
color.
Nationally, though, in terms of the congressional questions, the generic question, we have a +7 for the Democrats, and on this importance enthusiasm thing nationally, we see a 10-point advantage for the Democrats over the Republicans in terms of how people think whether this is important or not, the midterm elections. And I wanted to talk just a second about young people, because we've heard a lot about them.
Oh, you read my mind.
And we're going to hear a little bit more, I'm sure, between now and Election Day. We're seeing that the youth, people under 30 years of age, are significantly more in the Democrats' column in terms of whether they want to, do they disapprove of the president, how they're going to vote. What is not the case is, however, that they look like they're going to necessarily show up in greater numbers. Their measure of importance, significance in this election is the least of all the age groups, and that's the way it usually is. So we're not seeing any big change in those.
But when we ask that question in gradations, though, so we ask it: is it very important to you, this election? Is it important? Is it somewhat, et cetera? Very important and important, those numbers are pretty much in line with every other group. It's the very important that's not.
And I think
there is
that's
that difference
key.
between very important and important.
In question wording and in polling, when we want to get an understanding of whether someone will actually do something, we call it the top box. How many people are actually in that top box?
Which is
the most intensity. And we look at it at, the bottom box too. So when we're looking at, Trump's, approval rating, and we're looking at that intensity and that strength of support, it's very telling to see a number at the bottom that is almost twice the size as the number at the top. But in terms of if we want to predict behavior, if we want to get a sense of whether people are actually going to go out and do something, think top box.
So briefly, last word, each of us get it. So let's start with you, Lee. What should people be watching for between now and November based on what we're seeing in these polls? What are you looking for?
That enthusiasm gap difference, I think that's just very, very important. And of course, if this is a nationalized election, how is the president being seen? Does he cast a long shadow, or is he going to be a benefit to certain people in red states?
There are three groups that I think are really key: women, voters under 30, and then also Republicans. And I think those are three groups to really track, to see if the intensity and enthusiasm is maintained among Republicans and their support for the president, and then to see the intensity and interest in the election among those under 30, and whether suburban women are going to come out.
And I'm looking at this as a political reporter. It's mid-July. It is a long way to November, and there are a lot of dollars to be spent. This is likely to be the most expensive midterm election. There are estimates that more money could be spent in this midterm election than were spent in the presidential election in 2016, which is astonishing. That's never happened before. We've had that. That's what I'm looking at, is what happens when we go back into these states and the dollars are starting to flow. Are we seeing the movement that those dollars would generally indicate is going to happen? Closing of gaps, generally money mutters the waters and closes gaps. Yeah. I'm interested to see if that happens.
With targeted messages. We haven't really got a sense of, the messages that are going to be targeted by these candidates about.
But this really gets back
in
to
these states, we don't even have some of the candidates.
Yeah, we don't even have.
They're looking at primaries on August 7th and I think the 14th.
But it gets back to your point, actually, Lee, which is a really good one, about whether it's Trump or not. Those dollars for Democrats will largely be spent, from what we can see, linking Republicans to Trump, and the Republican dollars will be spent on something else, probably in most of these districts, in most of these states we're looking at that we just talked about. So all those dollars are going to be spent on these messages that we don't yet know exactly what they are, but which message resonates. Is this another Trump election, or is this something else? That, I think, is the most interesting question of all.
Absolutely.
Well, that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And we want to welcome back our executive producer and thank Mary Griffith, who always keeps us on track and keeps us honest with the numbers.
Yeah, she wasn't screaming, actually. That was a little toy I have last time.
Yeah, and she let us off the hook on that one.
So we also want to thank the Roper Center Archives at Cornell, which we do each and every program. They provide us the opportunity to look back in time. And, one thing came across my desk this week, that in their archives, they reported on a Gallup study of 1958, which was the first old age studies, if I can use that phrase. That's the one they did at the time. They interviewed 402 people who were over 95 years of age, and it's a data set that is. Some of these people, I think
they were alive in the Civil War.
Yeah, they actually, some people in this survey actually remembered the Civil War. Which is
really interesting.
So if you want to have a grand time, and the people who at the Roper who were sending this along our way just thought this was the most fun data set they've ever seen. Enjoy yourselves by going through that.
And you can send your questions to us at pollhub@marist.edu. Also, reach out to us on social media. That's the best way to connect. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter, Marist Poll on Facebook. And as always, when you look at that button on your phone or whatever device you're listening to us on, there's a subscribe button. Tap it, and that way, every time there's a new Poll Hub, it'll pop into your queue, and you'll be able to listen to us as soon as it comes right out of the oven. Fresh baked Poll Hub. Have a good week.